In this video, we're going to start learning how to use images, how to integrate them into our HTML pages, and how to style them using CSS. First, we're going to assume that we've collected our images together and we have the HTML page started that we would like to put our images into. Now notice I have created an images folder, again, aligned with our best practices for keeping file types together. I put this on the root level of my website, and then here's my web page that is going to be using those images, and I'll just show you inside this folder. I've got a couple of images here, and then I'm going to put those into this web page, and that's what we have over here in the code view. So let's take a look at the new tag that we're going to learn to do this, the HTML tag, and see how that works, and then we'll talk about using some CSS to style our images. So let's say I'd like to have an image here right underneath my heading. So again, remember, wherever you put that image tag, that's going to be the approximate location of that image on the page. And when it renders, depending on how you style it, you may slightly adjust where that image is. And the tag that we're going to learn to do this is just the ENG tag. Now we need to calculate our referential link to our image just like we would if we were linking to a page. So we're here, web page 04, that's the web page that I have open in Notepad, and I want to get to an image file that is here. So remember how we do that, and the property we're using rather than href as we've been doing before with our web links is source, src, but it's the same syntax in terms of equal sign, quotation marks, and then the full referential link path. So src, and then we want to go into the images folder, and then we want the exact file name. So that's where I'm going to click in here, and then you can see the file names. I'm going to use them in the order that I have created, 1.jpg in this case. And then the image tag, like the break tag, is a single tag, so it doesn't have an end, doesn't have a start and an end, it's just in and of itself. So I just need that little end slash at the end there to indicate that I've completed my coding here. And then if we reload, you can see we've got the image here. Now, ideally, maybe we would like this text to wrap around our image, right? To integrate that better into the content on the page. How do we do that? Well, that's where CSS starts to come into play. So I only have one image on the page right now, so I'm just going to use the image tag and apply my CSS directly to this tag. And again, I'm up in my head, and I'm inside my style section where I can put my CSS. I'm going to use a property called float, in this case, to allow the text to wrap around. In this case, I'm going to float left, and what that means is the floating content, in this case the image, because that's what I'm applying it to, is going to float on the left, and the float just means it's going to allow stuff to wrap around it on the right. And when you reload, you can see this effect. So that's nice. Now, it's a little bit tight here on the margin. So in order to address that, we would just add in some padding, right? Let's just do 5px. And that gives us a little buffer space, and that looks better. Let's go put in another image for practice, and let's say we're going to put this one in the next section down here. img src equals, and again, our referential link images, and remember I used a name, I'm using a systematic naming convention, so I know exactly what the file name is going to be. It's going to be R3 and then O2. And I mean RIII for Roman numeral 3. Now, let's say I want this one to float right. Okay, so now I have an issue here because I've used this just raw image to do the styling. So it's going to apply to all the images on the page. This one is also, oh, and this one also has another issue. I can demonstrate also how to work on resizing images. They're all going to float left right now because that's how I've done it. So let's say we don't necessarily want that. We want to be able to distinguish between some images floating left and some images floating right. So what we can do is just add in a custom class here, call it image left. And now what I would need to do in this first one is put in a class equals left. And let me just show you. So that's going to cause this one to continue to float left like it's been. And this one, since it doesn't have that class applied, is going to just do the default thing, which is to take up its own line, and then the content appears below. Now remember, what we ultimately want is for this one to float right. So we're going to create, as you can guess, something called image right. And I'm just going to copy the code to make it a little easier on myself. And I just need to then swap out here, right, and then here, left. Okay. And then down here, where the next image is, you should be able to guess this by now. I'm going to call that class right. And there we go. Now, we still have the problem with this overflowing its boundary and needing to be a little bit smaller. So that gives us an opportunity to think about the sizing of images. Now, really, ideally, you should size your images to the correct size before you start using them in your web page. And in the tips for editing images video, I'll talk about how to easily size images. But let's just say you don't have any image editing available to you, so you want to control the size using your CSS. You can do that. You definitely can do that. So in this case, let's just say we're going to create a class called resize. And we can set both the height and the width values. And I'm going to show you what it does when you set them independently and when you set them explicitly, and how that makes a difference. We can do it a few different ways. We can have a discrete size in pixels. We can also have a percentage. Okay, so I'm going to start with just a height of 100 px, just to see how that does. Now remember, when you're adding another class to something that already has a class applied, all you have to do is go into that class property, hit a space, and type in the name of the second class, and that will use that. Now, notice what happened here. Because I set the height, but not the width, it maintained the aspect ratio. So the aspect ratio is the proportion of height to width, right? So it did that automatically because I only set one of those properties. Now look what would happen if I set both the height and the width. And I already have the resize class applied, so I just have to reload to see the changes in this case. So if you set them both explicitly, it will become that exact size, but that often can distort your aspect ratio, right? So that is a distorted image. So we need to be careful. Now that's one reason that I say you should size your images using an image editor before you even start programming your website, or before you start using the images and pages. But again, if you do have to use your CSS to control image proportions, just be aware that you can distort them if you set both of these things explicitly. Now we can also just set the width, and that works a little bit better. That actually keeps it in the container. And sometimes, depending on what we're doing, if we want things to be exactly the same width, this can be a help. If we're just a little bit off, just a few pixels, that's fine. Now the other thing is we don't have to use explicit pixel size to create these dimensions. We also can use percentages, and we'll get to the universal design, but remember, one of the best practices was to use variable widths if at all possible. So widths that can adjust to the different way that the page might be displayed on different devices. So that would be using a percentage rather than a pixel dimension. So just to show you what that would look like, all right? Because what it's doing is taking up 50% of the available space, in this case, the width of this container, this article container on the screen. And if I change that and that box gets bigger, that image is just going to get bigger as well. Go ahead and put in a final image here, and let's put it in this last section. And this one I'll put sort of, within the text, just so we can see how that looks. You can get a sense of where you place your image tag is going to be related to where it is in your text. So again, images, and then r303.jpg. Put this one on the left. So now that one is floating left. We got one floating right, one floating left. So let me just talk about a few other things to note as you're working with your images and as we're working on our CSS with the images. What if I took this image here, and I think I'll just actually make a copy, and I put it down here right by our one that's floating right. So now I've got one that's floating left, floating right in the same sort of area. What do you think that is going to do? Let's go ahead and scroll down to this area and reload it. Okay, so see what happens here. So it has one floating left, one floating right, and then the text goes sort of in the middle of that. What if I wanted to center my image? That's actually a little bit trickier than you might at first think. So you might think it's as easy as something like this. Right, creating a class called center and then just having it float in the center. So that didn't really work. So it's on its own line now, but it is definitely not floating in the center. That's not how it's going to work. Now, if you remember, the way that we got our articles to be centered up was using margin auto. Remember that in our CSS. So each of our articles is centered, and that is because we basically said it's going to be less than 100%, and then the margin on the left and the margin on the right, we're just going to calculate that automatically, and what that does is cause it to center up. We could try that theory. So same exact code, and that also is not working. So what's going on here? So images are interesting because you would think, especially when in this default view, they inhabit their own line and things don't wrap around them, that they are a block rather than an inline element. But images are actually kind of a weird animal, and they don't explicitly have a designation of that sort. They sort of behave like a block, but when you try to center them in the typical ways, then they behave like an inline element. So you have to explicitly code them as a block in order to get our normal way of centering things to work. It's not that hard to do. We just need to use the display code and tell it that this image is in fact a block, and then our margin auto is the thing that we should use to be able to center that image. So there you go. So, and again, when you're centering, we're not going to get a wrap on the both sides unless we float our paragraphs, in which case our paragraph can start to float around the image. That would look a little weird though, honestly. So a centered image is going to inhabit its own space. Now, just for fun, let me just note, let's say we were to take our left and right floating images and put them alongside in the code our centered image. And notice I put them in this order, left, right, center, but because of the way we have that CSS encoded, we're going to end up with our images looking like that, left, center, right. Okay, so the code order doesn't matter quite as much as what the CSS is telling it to do. So that gives you a sense of how to position that image on the page. Now, another thing you can do is apply other types of coding to your images. So let's just say we would like all of our images to have a consistent border around them. And so I'm just going to apply this directly to the image tag itself, and then that will affect all the images on the page. And we know how to do borders. Let's do a 3px so that we can really see it. Let's grab a color, maybe something light that'll show up on our page. And let's do dashed instead of a solid line, just to shake that up a little bit. So you see what's happening? We end up with this dashed border around our images. And the floating ones you're going to have the border around the padding as well. So just note that that is going to happen if you do this. Let me show you another thing you can do though. Remember the border radius that we used to create the rounded corners? You can apply that on an image as well. And notice what happens on the tight corners. The image itself actually becomes rounded. And in fact, I can show you Let's make that a really pronounced radius. Right? You can actually turn these into ovals. You could even turn these into circles if you really wanted to. And notice again, it's applying to all the images on the page. So this is one of those things, if you wanted to do something like this, you would ideally have images that were all, had similar proportions so that they would have a consistent look to them. And again, that's where an image editor comes in handy, and you create the images in the size that you need before you start putting them in your pages. But again, we'll get to that in a later video where I talk about some image editing tips. You can play with a lot of different properties that you already know from your past CSS experimentation, and you can apply those to images as well. So just keep that in mind. And then we learned some new things here in terms of the image tag itself, and then positioning your images in relationship to your content.